Miller says, "I am almost home. Glory, glory," with 2 exclamation points, glory with 3 exclamation points. So he accepts it not on the basis of Scripture, which was unusual for Miller, but he bases it on what he sees happening around him. William Miller was at home on October 22. Exactly what he was doing that day, we don't have a record. It may be of interest to you to know that we have almost no records, first-hand accounts of what Millerites were doing on October 22, 1844. For instance, we have no idea where James White was that day or where Ellen White was that day. We don't know. There's no record. It's almost as if it was so horrendous, the fact that Jesus did not come, they didn't even record it. They didn't write it down. So we have very, very few, only 1 or 2 eyewitness accounts of things that actually happened on October 22. All we know is that Miller was at home that day. And so here's his house. This is the way it looks today. It's owned by the church, as I mentioned yesterday. If you're ever up to that part of New York State, we would be glad to host you to the house. Or the docents there, I won't be there, but the docents that are there would be glad to host you to his house. You know the famous statement, I'm sure, by Miller after that disappointment. When people asked him about it, he said, "I have fixed my mind on another time, and here I mean to stand until God gives me more light. And that is today, today, and today, until he comes." The tradition is that the Millerites in that area waited on a piece of outcropping limestone there on Miller's farm, which today is called Ascension Rock. I don't mean to disappoint you because it's moving to go out there and to think about the Millerites probably met there. That's the tradition that's come down in the Miller family, but we have no contemporary evidence that anybody met on that rock. And here again is the statement that I just read, that he had fixed his mind on another time, and that is today, today, today. Miller had given everything preaching the first angel's message. His health was broken. He did a little bit of public work after October 22, but not very much. And this is a picture of William Miller's bedroom in his house. The bed that's there belonged to William Miller. It's the bed that he died in on December 20, 1849. He was just 67 years of age. The rocking chair and the chair you can see in the foreground, those were all pieces of furniture that belonged to William Miller. They have been given back to us by various descendants of William Miller. It's kind of interesting. The Miller family has had to put up for so many years with people making fun of this crazy old man who predicted the end of the world, that when the Adventist church bought the farm and wanted to restore the farm, several descendants who had inherited pieces of furniture or personal artifacts that had belonged to William Miller, they have donated them to us. Just because the church, our church, is saying something positive about the man that's their ancestor, that they have had to listen to all this negativity to or about all these years. And buried not far away is William Miller's grave, and you can go to that. It's just around the corner from his house, and the original headstone is still there. Ellen White was shown and wrote later in what's now in early writings that angels watch the precious dust of this servant of God, and he will come forth at the sound of the last trumpet. Remember, he only preached the first angel's message. He opposed the preaching of the second angel's message to come out of Babylon. He said, no, stay in your churches. And he did not know anything about the Sabbath or the state of the dead, any of those. He rejected all of that. And yet, God showed Ellen White that in the resurrection, this man lived up to everything he knew and preached it with all of his heart, and that he will come forth at the sound of the last trump. Kind of helps us keep things in perspective sometimes when we think about people out there who are not preaching everything that we are, and yet if they're living up to the light, all the light that they have received and have been impressed that they should accept, they will be saved. And this is the case with William Miller. Buried right next to him is his wife, Lucy Miller. She died 5 years after his death. And it's interesting that in late 1852, Joseph Bates on one of his many preaching trips, goes to Lowhampton, New York, and visits with Mrs. Miller. And he reports in the Review, Joseph Bates reports in the Review and Herald in January of 1853 about his visit with Mrs. Miller, the widow of William Miller, and said how he preached it all. That's Joseph Bates for you. He preached it all, including the Seventh-day Sabbath. And he reports that she said he might be right about that, though we have no evidence that Lucy ever kept the Seventh-day Sabbath. So as we close this part, and then I'll go into the Jane Andrews part, I want to read to you a quotation from William Miller. This is something that he did not write in the intensity of leading up to the spring or the fall disappointments of 1844. No, instead this was written in 1832. But it will give you an insight if you've never read it or heard it before. It will give you an insight into how real the second coming of Christ was in the life and thinking of William Miller. It was a letter he wrote to a friend of his by the name of Truman Hendricks. I will just read the last few lines of the letter. Look again. See crowns and kings and kingdoms tumbling to the dust. See lords and nobles, captains and mighty men, all arming for the bloody demon fight. See the carnivorous fowls fly screaming through the air. See these signs. Behold, the heavens grow black with clouds. The sun has veiled himself. The moon, pale and forsaken, hangs in midair. The hail descends. The seven thunders utter loud their voices. The lightnings send their vivid gleams of sulphurous flame abroad. And the great city of the nations falls to rise no more, forever and forever. At this dread moment, look. Oh, look and see what means that ray of light. The clouds have burst asunder. The heavens appear. The great white throne is in sight. Amazement fills the universe with awe. He comes. Behold, the Savior comes. Lift up your heads, ye saints. He comes. And he signs it, William Miller. Now we're Seventh Day what? Well, I'm glad one person knows. Anybody else know who we are? We're Seventh Day what? Well, now three of you know. Anybody else know what we are? We're Seventh Day what? Adventists. Now, does the rest of you know? We're Adventists. What does that mean? We believe what? Jesus is coming. Is that really important in your life anymore? You know, I've been an Adventist when was I baptized? So over 60 years I've been an Adventist. And how exciting, I need to ask myself the same thing I ask you. How exciting, how real, how vivid is the second coming of Christ in your life and in your ministry? For Miller, it overarched everything he did. As I mentioned to you yesterday, every person he saw was a candidate for heaven. He'd fallen in love with Jesus. He wanted them to be there too when Jesus returned. And the question that we as Seventh-day Adventist administrators need to be asking ourselves is how real, how important is it in the decisions that we're making in our own personal lives? How often does it come up in a discussion at a committee? What impact will this thing that we're voting on right now have in terms of eternity? I'm afraid if your committees are like the ones I sit on, it doesn't come up very often. And I say that as director of the White Estate. I don't bring it up as often as I should either. But I think it's time for us as Adventist administrators to think again about every decision that we make. What impact does that decision, will it have in terms of eternity? And I know we say, well, it's unwritten. Yeah, but sometimes the unwritten gets forgotten. So I would just encourage us all, in the light of William Miller's experience, to get passionate again about the return of Christ. Now I'm going to shift gears, and Pastor Maposa and I talked the other day. I'm going to close with the story about Jane Andrews. You said you wanted me to, so I'm going to try to honor the chief's request. So give me just a second here to shift PowerPoints. Now I believe everyone here has heard the name Jane Andrews. If you haven't, then you haven't been listening to Dr. Stavanovich, because he's from Andrews University, named for Jane Andrews. So if you've slept through those presentations, you've missed a great deal, but you've also, if you've never heard of it before, you've heard of J.N. Andrews. All right, so we want to talk a little bit about Elder Andrews, who was the church's first official overseas missionary. If you're going to have a text that would summarize his life, I think, as well as any other text, Philippians 3:13 and 14, reading from the King James Version. Brethren, I count not myself to have apprehended, but this one thing I do, forgetting those things which are behind, and reaching forth unto those things which are before, I press toward the mark for the prize of the high calling of God in Christ Jesus. So, who was this man? And again, what I've been trying to do in my presentations is to bring some life to some of these names that we see in our Bible, our church history textbooks. He's best known for being Adventism's first official missionary, as I mentioned. He authored a book called The History of the Sabbath. He was the third president of the General Conference from 1867 to 1869. He served as editor of the Review for 2 years, 1869 and 1870, and he was a brilliant scholar. When I say brilliant, let me just tell you a little bit more about him. As a teenager, growing up in the center part of the state of Maine, in a place called Paris Hill, Maine. Now he's a teenager, about 15 years of age. He asks his father, Edward Andrews, to buy some books for him. Now, what kind of books would a teenager growing up in America want their father to buy for them? I have no idea. But let me tell you what John Andrews asked his father to buy. He wanted his father to order books so that he could teach himself. He could read them and learn to read the Bible in Greek, Hebrew, and Latin. Remember, this is being homeschooled practically. I mean, it's primitive education that he had, but he's teaching himself. Eventually, John could read the Bible in 7 languages. He was once asked, is it true that you can repeat the entire Bible from memory? And he said no, he could not repeat the entire Bible from memory. But he did say, if all copies of the New Testament were lost, I could reproduce it. And we also know that in addition to having memorized the entire New Testament, he had great sections of the Old Testament, but not all of it memorized. It is little wonder that many years later, Ellen White, in describing Elder Andrews, wrote to the early members in Europe, we sent to you the ablest man in all our ranks. Now, J.N. Andrews had a family. This is his wife, Angeline Stevens Andrews. You may not know this, but let me just throw in something I don't have in my notes. But Angeline had a sister by the name of Harriet Stevens, who married Uriah Smith. So you may not have known, Uriah Smith and J.N. Andrews were brothers-in-law. Now, J.N. Andrews had 2 children shown in this picture. There were at least 2 others that had died earlier before this picture was taken. Since we're focusing on his, just kind of summarizing his trips and his mission in Europe, let's go right straight to that. In 1874, he set sail from Boston, Massachusetts in the United States, heading to Liverpool, England. And accompanying him was a young man from Switzerland by the name of Ademar Volumier. With J.N. Andrews were 2 of his children, Charles Andrews, who was 16 at the time. I'm not going to come back much more to Charles, so let me just summarize a little bit, and then we're going to focus more on J.N. Andrews and his daughter, Mary. But Charles will stay in Switzerland after Elder Andrews died. He would later in life return to the United States. He would work at the Review and Herald for many years, died in 1927, and is buried not far from the old General Conference building in Tacoma Park, Maryland. But let's move on to the younger sister, Mary. Mary was 12 years of age when they left Boston for Europe. She turned 13 while they were in England. They stayed in England a short time before they traveled on to Switzerland, which was his goal in terms of where he wanted to try to establish the church formally in Europe. First place that they moved to in Switzerland was Neuchâtel. Now Charles, the brother that I just mentioned, Charles, because there was no mother, remember, I hadn't told you, she died in 1872. So Angeline did not go to Europe. She'd been dead for 2 years at the time. So it's just J.N. Andrews, who I guess today we would call a single parent. Back then he would have been called a widower. So it was J.N. Andrews and his 2 children. So Charles, he had the responsibility of going to the market and buying food. Sometimes it looked like what he was used to in America. Sometimes it looked different. And of course, he doesn't know French yet. They're living in the French-speaking part of Switzerland. He doesn't know French yet. He's going to learn it, but he doesn't know it yet. And so he's trying to talk to these people at the market in a language he doesn't understand, and he's using coins that don't look like the ones he'd had in America. And he would bring it home to Mary, who by this time is 13, and for a period of time, she served as the cook for the family. Now, don't ever let it be said that our young people are not involved in the mission of the church. These two, though they were not on the payroll of the church, these two young people were as much missionaries as their father. The house where they lived I should back up before I get to this picture. They left Neuchâtel. The reason they moved from Neuchâtel to Basel, now we'll go to this picture, this is the house they lived in Basel, was because J.N. Andrews wanted to start publishing a paper. And the printers in Neuchâtel were not the same quality, at least that was J.N. Andrews' evaluation, as the printers in Basel. And he wanted a quality paper. So he moved the family from Neuchâtel to Basel. His office was on the second floor at this end of this building. And the first issue of the Signs of the Times, the French Signs of the Times, was published in July of 1876. Now, most of the original articles in the paper were actually French translations from the American Review and Herald, because J.N. Andrews himself doesn't know French, and we don't have many members that speak French, so they would take the American articles, or the English articles, I should say, for the American Review and Herald, and they would have them translated. Occasionally, J.N. Andrews would write something, and it would be translated also, be translated by a French translator, set into type by a French typesetter, and then, as you can imagine, proofread by a French proofreader. Now, the Andrews family, they were trying to learn French, and so in 1876, they signed a covenant. The three of them signed a formal handwritten covenant in which they pledged to each other that they would only speak French for 23 hours of each day. 1 hour of each day they could speak English. Now, I can only imagine what it must have been when that clock was getting closer to that 1 hour when they could speak English, especially in the beginning when they hadn't learned any French yet or much. They were probably all jabbering, just talking as fast as they could for that 1 hour, because they knew in 1 hour they'd signed to each other that they would not preach anything, speak anything but French. Unless, they said, they could think of the German word. They were also trying to learn German. So if they couldn't think of the French word during those 23 hours and they could think of the German word, they could use it. But you can imagine what it must have been like, at least initially, during that 1 hour. Now, Mary Andrews, the daughter, 13, 14, she has a fluency for languages like her father. In fact, she is reported to have learned French so well that she spoke it like a French girl. So when the copy that for the French Signs of the Times, those issues of the paper, when they had been set in type, proofread, everything had been done by the French proofreader. Guess what they did next? They gave it to Mary so that she could find any mistakes that the French proofreader had missed. In other words, she was really a missionary, not on the payroll of the church, but she really was doing service for the church. Tragically, one day, Mary began to cough. At first, everyone just thought it was a cold and it would go away, but it didn't go away. As you can imagine, Elder Andrews becomes concerned over his daughter's health, and so he takes her to a physician there in Switzerland, and the Swiss physician examines Mary, and his diagnosis was consumption. Today we would call it tuberculosis, and it was a quick consumption of which the doctor said there's no known cure. You can imagine what this did for Elder Andrews. I mean, he was beside himself. About the same time, he receives an invitation from James White back in Battle Creek, Michigan in the United States, inviting Elder Andrews to come to the 1878 General Conference session. Elder Andrews agreed. What James White wanted was a report from J.N. Andrews. Now, this doesn't sound very exciting to any of us who have attended a general conference session in recent years, because you know the sessions are full of missionaries, active missionaries, and retired missionaries. But at this time, in 1878, this was the one missionary. And praise the Lord, you read a few of the accounts of people that J.N. Andrews is coming. Look what the Lord is doing. I mean, there's going to be a live report from outside the United States at the 1878 session. J.N. Andrews was not interested in making history. That's not why he wanted to go. He wrote back to James White, said, yes, of course, I will come, but may I have permission to bring Mary with me at my expense. He could not bring himself to ask the church to pay for the travel for Mary to come back to the United States. He didn't want the church bearing that cost. But J.N. Andrews had a hope. And we'll get to that in just a second, but he did get permission to bring Mary. So they made their way all the way from Basel, Switzerland, clear to Battle Creek in all of, well, about 2 weeks. And Dr. Stavanovich is going to be within 75 miles of Battle Creek in less than a day. So things have changed a bit between 1878 and today. But what does J.N. Andrews want? As soon as he gets to Battle Creek, by the way, this is the way the sanitarium looked in 1878. You may have seen pictures of it when it's much larger. This is the way it looked in 1878 when J.N. Andrews arrives with his daughter. But what he wants is to get his daughter into the sanitarium. He wants J.H. Kellogg, Dr. Kellogg, this brilliant young physician who's just graduated a couple years before from medical school, to examine Mary. Maybe Dr. Kellogg knows something about tuberculosis that the physicians in Basel, Switzerland didn't know. But after examining Mary, Dr. Kellogg said to J.N. Andrews, the diagnosis of the physicians in Europe was correct. She has what they call quick consumption, this very short-lasting form of tuberculosis. And there's no I have nothing humanly to offer to you in terms of a cure. Elder Andrews sat by the bedside of his dying daughter. Dr. Kellogg would come in to him and say, you must come out, you cannot stay in there. If you stay in there, you may contract tuberculosis. Elder Andrews said, I have to stay with her. She has no one else. I must stay with her. And so she was there and died at the age of 17 on November 27, 1878. In an autograph album that they have in the center, in the Heritage Research Center at Loma Linda University, Elder Andrews wrote the following thing the next day. Yesterday morning at 4:30, my dear daughter Mary F. Andrews fell asleep in death. This child rendered me great assistance in Europe, and when we encountered privation and want, she met all with invincible courage and with patience, faith, and hope. What she suffered caused her to fall by the quick consumption. She has fallen in the work at a time when her services had become of great value. Who is there that will rise up to take her place? He dated it, signed it, dated it, Battle Creek, November 28, 1878, J.N. Andrews. Elder Andrews found the loss of Mary simply overwhelming. For weeks afterwards, he was prostrated with grief. Somehow he could not understand why he had been called to make such a sacrifice. He said to a friend, and I'm quoting now, I seem to be having hold of God with a numb hand. Ellen White, who was in Texas at the time, she was not in Battle Creek, heard, of course, about Mary's death, and she wrote a letter, a very comforting letter to J.N. Andrews, and I want to just quote a couple of lines from it. She said, I was shown you with head bowed down and mourning as you followed Mary to her last home in this world. Then I saw the Lord look lovingly upon you. I saw the life giver come, and your wife and children come forth from their graves, clothed with immortal splendor. And she signed the letter, your sympathizing sister, Ellen G. White. I want to pause for just a moment and say something that might be of interest to you. Ellen White saw the resurrection in vision a number of times through the years, but she saw very few individuals who would actually be translated. But on this occasion, in his love for the grieving Elder Andrews, God showed Ellen White that among those who will be translated was his wife and Mary. Elder Andrews remained in the United States through the dedication of the Dime Tabernacle, which I have the wrong date here. It was actually April 20, not April 1879. Jane Andrews preached the dedicatory sermon at the Dime Tabernacle, and the following month he returned to Europe. And if possible, he threw himself into the work with even more determination. Why? Because there was one more grave in Mount Hope Cemetery in Rochester, New York. One more personal reason why Elder Andrews wanted Jesus to return, because you see, buried there is his beloved wife, Angeline. And I say beloved because, as near as anybody could tell, Angeline and Jane Andrews really did have a very close, loving relationship. We have Angeline's diary for a few years. It's also at Loma Linda. And if you read through it, you can tell there was a lot of love between those two. And here's his beloved Angeline is buried there. In fact, Ellen White urged Jane Andrews when he went to Europe to get remarried, but he couldn't bring himself to because he was so much in love with Angeline still. And of course, now there's also Mary. A few years after Elder Andrews returned to Europe, he began one day to cough. At first they thought it was just a cold, but it didn't go away. He went to the physician to find out what was going on with his cough, and his fears were affirmed. He also had contracted tuberculosis. In the months that followed Elder Andrews' diagnosis or contracting tuberculosis, he went through the kind of stages, at least looking at his story, he seems to have gone through the stages that many people go through when they're diagnosed with an incurable disease. At first you don't want to admit that it's happened to you, and then sometimes you resent it. But then you have calm acceptance. As the disease progressed, and it also ravaged his body, his widowed mother, her husband had died, and another brother of Jane Andrews had also died. His widowed mother, Sarah Pottle Andrews, living in the United States, heard about her son's diagnosis, and she wanted to come to Switzerland to minister to him. But Jane Andrews said, no, I don't want my mother seeing me in this emaciated condition. However, others intervened, and eventually Elder Andrews agreed for his mother to come to Switzerland. Realizing that unless God chose to heal him, he could not live long, Elder Andrews worked as hard as he could, writing and editing articles for future issues of the French Signs of the Times. Given his brilliant mind, everybody there in the office knew that anything that was unfinished, if God didn't choose to heal Elder Andrews, anything that was left unfinished at the time of his death, none of them would be able to complete. Growing continually weaker, Elder Andrews, we're told, would come downstairs in the morning from his apartment to breakfast. He would sit at the table, staring down at the mush or whatever they were serving, and with tears streaming down his cheeks, he would mutter to himself, if only I could force myself to eat, I would have strength to carry on. But the disease had completely robbed him of his appetite. And eventually he would get up from the table and shuffle back to his room. During these months, he wrote a letter to his brother-in-law, Uriah Smith, and here's what he said in it. It's kind of remarkable to me. Dear Uriah, at the present time, by reason of my great prostration, I am brought to look death in the face. There is one thing that troubles me, which I lay before you in the form of a petition. It will fall to your lot to mention my death in the review. I beg you to make the simplest and briefest statement possible, and I solemnly charge you to exclude every word of eulogy. 1/3 of a column in the review will suffice for all that should be said. I make this request because I fear that your kind regard for me will constrain you to say what I do not merit and what ought not to be said. Listen to this next sentence. My best acts have had some trace of selfishness in them, or have been lacking in love toward God and man. Therefore, I beseech you, therefore, by all the affection which you bear me, that you will regard this my earnest petition. And then he goes on to say, would you please send a note to J.H. Wagner, who was the editor of the Signs of the Times on the West Coast of the United States, asking him not to put any eulogy in a notice of Jane Andrews' death out there in the Signs either. And it's interesting that when you look at the first notices of Jane Andrews' death that appear in the review, it is simply a short notice about his passing. There are no words of eulogy. Now eventually they will come, but not in the initial. This is the house where Jane Andrews was living in 1883 in Basel, Switzerland. The last several weeks of his life, he was bedridden. By this time, he was too weak to work on any of the unfinished articles that were on his desk. The weekend of October 19 to 21, 1883, the few workers that we had in Europe at that time came to Basel for workers' meetings. Several times during that weekend, they came upstairs to Elder Andrews' room to pray around the bedside of their dying leader. On Sunday morning, October 21, 1883, in his illness, it seems that Elder Andrews thought it was October 22, the anniversary of the great disappointment. There on his bedside, the dying man thought of one thing more that he wanted to do. In barely a whisper, he asked if someone would bring him a pencil and a piece of paper. What could he possibly want with paper and pencil? He hasn't done anything, he hasn't touched an article for some time. Why does he want paper and pencil? But someone went to the adjoining room, which happened to be his office, and brought a piece of paper and a pencil to the dying man. And there, with the last strength that he had, he scrawled across that piece of paper, I leave to the European mission $500. He had made provision for everything else. But as he lay dying, the thought apparently crossed his mind, is there anything more that I can do for the cause of God? Even in this condition, is there anything more that I can do? Yes, there's that $500 that I have not made provision for. Later that afternoon, several of the workers that were there for the workers' meetings again came upstairs and knelt in prayer around his bedside. Seated next to him, up by his head, kind of fanning him, was his mother. And the others knelt and prayed. And when they got up from the prayer, someone looked over and said, he's gone. And it's true, he had died during that prayer. Now we are told by Ellen White that this message, the message that you and I are leaders of, this message will close with power and strength far exceeding the midnight cry. Now, if that's true, which I believe it is, if that's true, that means that some generation is going to display the same spirit of sacrifice and commitment as did our pioneers. Every time I tell this story and I ask the same questions to them that I'm asking myself, asking to whoever I'm telling the story to, that I'm going to ask you now, I ask myself, I ask you, if I did not think that we would wake up to see the sunrise tomorrow, among our last conscious thoughts, would we be thinking, is there anything more that we can do for the cause of God? Are we the generation that's going to get serious about finishing the work so Jesus can return? If not us, who? If not now,